Every small town has a story they don't tell strangers. If you travel down the interstate long enough and take the wrong exit, you'll eventually find yourself in a place that looks perfectly ordinary on the surface, but harbors a rot underneath. Usually, it's a cliche town legend, a rusted iron bridge where something terrible happened 40 years ago, casting a long shadow over local memory. A Victorian house at the dead end of a gravel road that nobody uses anymore, left to crumble into the weeds. Or maybe just a name, a specific heavy name, that makes the regulars at the local diner go completely quiet if you happen to say it out loud in the wrong company. Those stories are common. They are the baseline currency of rural superstition. Harlow, population 1,200, had something different. Harlow didn't rely on ghosts or old rumors to keep people in line. Harlow had a rule. You could move there without any trouble. You could lease a charming little house on a tree-lined street, open a tab at the only bar in town, and let your kids enroll in the neat red brick schoolhouse on the corner. The townspeople would be perfectly friendly to you, not with the defensive hostility of outsiders, but with a genuine, polite warmth. The streets were clean, the lawns manicured, the air sweet. It was a perfectly normal, perfectly nice place to rebuild a broken life. As long as you were home by midnight. I moved to Harlow on a rainy Thursday in March. By the time the following Sunday rolled around, I understood that the curfew wasn't a joke or a quaint piece of local folklore. By the Sunday after that, the true horror of the town settled deep into my bones. I understood why no one who has ever successfully left Harlow ever talks about what happens to the ones who don't make it across their thresholds in time. My name is Daniel Marsh. I am 31 years old, and I am going to tell you everything exactly as it happened. I need you to stay with me until the very last sentence of this recording, because the final thing I am going to tell you. The final drive into Harlow felt less like a journey and more like a slow descent into an isolation chamber. The route took me off the main interstate, forcing my sedan onto a narrow, two-lane state road that cut through 12 miles of flat, unyielding farmland. The gray winter corn stalks stood like skeletal sentinels under a heavy, overcast sky. And then, with an unsettling abruptness, the fields vanished, and I crossed the town limits into Harlow. My first immediate thought was that the town looked exactly like a movie set, not in a charming, nostalgic New England way, but in a highly specific, uncanny way. It was too precisely what a small town was supposed to look like. It lacked the organic imperfections of reality. The main thoroughfare was predictably called Main Street. There was a diner with a faded neon sign reading the Harlow Diner. Next to it sat a dark wood tavern called the Tap Room. There was a local hardware store, a two-chair barber shop, a small independent grocery store, a brick post office, and at the very end of the long block, a white clapboard church. The church had a neat black-lettered sign standing on its manicured lawn. Harlow Community Fellowship. All are welcome. Sundays, 10 a.m. Everything was spotless. The sidewalks were completely free of cracks or weeds. The storefronts looked like they had been freshly painted that same morning. Even the crisp American flags mounted on the green lampposts looked brand new, completely untouched by wind or rain. It was exactly 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, and the streets were completely dead. I saw only one person. A middle-aged woman walking a golden retriever was crossing the asphalt, half a block ahead of me. As my car approached, she slowed down and stared directly through my windshield. Her eyes locked onto my out-of-state license plates. Her expression wasn't overtly hostile, nor was it welcoming. It was analytical, evaluative. It was the exact look a person gives a strange, unexpected object when they are trying to calculate whether it is going to cause a massive problem. She watched me until I turned the corner. My rental house was located on Birch Street, a quiet residential road 4 blocks away from Maine. It was small, single story, and painted a stark, clean white that matched the rest of the town's rigid aesthetic. The neighbors didn't wait for me to introduce myself. They came directly to my door. Both of them appeared within the first 48 hours of my arrival, carrying containers of food and displaying an intense, immediate friendliness that I initially misread as small town hospitality. It took me a week to realize it was actually something else entirely. They were scouting me. The first was Margaret Cho, a woman in her late 50s who lived in the neat blue house to my left. She knocked on my door Friday afternoon holding a glass dish of hot casserole. She was polite, giving me a thorough breakdown of the local recycling schedule and recommending the best mechanic in the area. But as we stood on the threshold, she slipped in a piece of information with an air of calculated casualness. She told me she had lived in Harlow for exactly 23 years and had always found the community to be very supportive. She emphasized the word supportive with a bizarre rhythmic weight, the way people use a specific word when they mean something dangerous but are physically unable to say it out loud. The second visitor arrived on Saturday evening. His name was Pete Greer, a man in his mid-40s who lived directly across the street. He brought over a cold six-pack of beer and a broad, easy smile, the kind of immediate, unearned friendliness that has always made me slightly suspicious in adults. We ended up sitting on my front porch for over an hour as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Pete did most of the talking, painting a picture of Harlow's history, its tight-knit community events, and the church. He mentioned the fellowship 3 separate times within the span of an hour, his eyes tracking my reactions. It's the kind of place where the old ways still mean something, Daniel, he said, leaning back against the wooden railing and taking a long sip from his bottle. People here respect the traditions. We look out for each other. What kind of traditions are we talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Pete smiled, a wide, symmetrical expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. You'll see for yourself soon enough. The annual harvest gathering is in October. That's the big one. But really, the core of it, the main thing, is just. He broke off, staring out into the front yard, carefully selecting his next words. Being home when you're supposed to be home. The midnight curfew, I said bluntly. The moment the words left my mouth, something violent shifted in his expression. The easygoing, neighborly mask didn't. I told myself it was curiosity. I told myself it was the rational, analytical instinct of a city-bred tech worker trying to map out the eccentricities of his new environment. I called it research. But if I'm being entirely honest with you, it was something uglier, something hardwired into my personality. I have always been the kind of person who, when specifically warned not to touch a hot stove, has to feel the heat radiate against his palm before he truly believes it will burn. I've always needed to know why. On my first Friday night in Harlow, I sat on my secondhand sofa and watched the digital numbers on my phone creep forward. At 11:45 p.m., my alarm went off, a sharp, artificial buzz that sounded violently loud in the quiet house. My heart did a sudden, uncomfortable flip in my chest. I stood up, swallowed hard, pulled on a heavy canvas jacket, and walked slowly toward the front door. Every instinct in my physical body told me to stop. It wasn't a logical thought process. It was a deeply primal, somatic signal. It was the exact sensation of standing at the edge of a high dive platform in the dead of winter, looking down at frozen water, knowing exactly what the impact will feel like, while every nerve ending produces a unified, screaming argument against taking a step forward. My hand hovered over the brass doorknob for a full 30 seconds, trembling slightly, before I finally turned it and pulled the door open. I stepped out onto the porch. I looked at the surrounding houses. Every single building on Birch Street was completely dark, not bedroom dark, where a faint television glow or a hallway nightlight cuts through the blinds. They were completely, uniformly extinguished. It looked as though every resident of Harlow had simultaneously pulled their main fuses, sat down in the center of their pitch-black living rooms, and agreed to remain perfectly still in the dark. Then, at the very end of Birch Street, where the smooth asphalt curved away and yielded to the dense, jagged wall of the pine forest, something moved. I want to be mathematically precise about this. It wasn't a sudden, darting movement designed to escape detection. It was slow, agonizingly deliberate, and morning brought with it a profound sense of psychological whiplash. By 9 a.m., Harlow looked precisely like the postcard town I had entered 2 days prior. The sun cut through the gray clouds, reflecting off the spotless storefronts of Main Street. Neighbors nodded politely to one another. A mail carrier pushed a metal cart down the sidewalk. The smell of fresh diesel from a passing delivery truck filled the air. The terror of the previous night felt fake, like the lingering fragments of a bad fever dream. But my body remembered. My muscles were stiff from hours on the kitchen floor, and my eyes were bloodshot from a total lack of sleep. I needed to get out of the house. I needed answers. I walked down to the Harlow Diner, the heavy wooden door chiming cheerily as I pushed it open. The air inside smelled faintly of burnt coffee, maple syrup, and bleached counters. I slid onto a vinyl stool at the laminated counter and ordered a black coffee from a waitress whose plastic name tag read Joe. She had an old, weathered face with deep-set lines around her eyes, the kind of face that suggested she had lived through multiple iterations of the same town, seen almost everything, and had long since lost the capacity to be surprised by anything. I began to ask her general, casual questions about the town's history, trying to sound like an enthusiastic new resident. Joe was accommodating, speaking in a practiced mechanical drawl as she wiped down the stainless steel espresso machine. She told me Harlow was founded in 1887 as a cooperative farming community. She listed off the original founding families, names like the Ellisons, the Greers, and several others whose descendants still own the properties along Main Street. She mentioned the church at the end of the block, referring to it simply as the Fellowship, though she spoke about it with a cold, detached neutrality that suggested she wasn't a member herself, but was smart enough never to criticize it in public. "How long have you lived here, Joe?" I asked, wrapping both hands around the hot ceramic mug. "Born right down the road," she said, her voice flat. At exactly 2 p.m., the diner was a tomb. The neon open sign had been toggled off, and the blinds facing Main Street were drawn shut, casting long, geometric shadows across the linoleum floor. Joe didn't make me wait at the counter. She gestured for me to follow her to the furthest corner booth, away from the kitchen doors and the windows. She sat across from me, her hands folded tightly on the formica table, and spoke for 45 minutes with the steady, unblinking pace of someone who had decided to perform a necessary, dangerous surgery. The Fellowship, she explained, wasn't a church in any theological sense. It possessed the superficial anatomy of one: the white steeple, the hymnals, the Sunday morning gatherings. But its actual function was administrative. It was the mechanism through which the town managed an ancient non-negotiable agreement. The founding families hadn't built Harlow and then been haunted. They had brought the agreement with them from wherever they had come from before. An agreement with what? I asked, my voice cracking. Joe looked past me, her eyes focusing on the cracks in the window blinds. The old families have a specific word for it, she whispered. They call it the tenant, like an entity that rents out the territory, like something that occupied this valley first and allowed humans to clear the trees and build their little grid of houses, provided they keep up their end of the lease. And what is their end? Midnight, Joe said, the word landing with a heavy, sickening finality. Everyone inside by midnight. No lights visible from the street. No noise. You surrender the town to the tenant between midnight and 4 a.m. And in exchange, it lets you live your lives in absolute peace for the other 20 hours of the day. What happens if you stay out? I asked, remembering the silhouette under the streetlight. What is it? Joe shook her head, a grim line tightening around her mouth. Nobody knows what it looks like in full, but I know what happens to the people who break the rule. I've lived here my whole life, Daniel. I know 3 people who didn't make it home in time. One was a boy I went to school with when I was 12. I made a mistake. I can admit that to you now, sitting here in the quiet luxury of hindsight. But at the time, it felt like the only logical path left open to me. If the fellowship was the administrative heart of Harlow's agreement, if the old families truly understood what the tenant was, what it required, and how it operated, then the church was the only place where the actual answers were kept. I couldn't just sit in my house and let the walls close in on me. I needed to see the people who had signed my life away without my consent. I went to the Sunday morning service when I pulled up to the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street. I was shocked by the sheer volume of cars. The gravel parking lot was completely overflowing, vehicles lined up bumper to bumper along the grass. For a town of only 1,200 people, the turnout was staggering. It was standing room only inside. As I slipped through the heavy oak double doors and took a spot against the back wall, a suffocating realization washed over me. This wasn't an optional weekly gathering. This wasn't a matter of personal faith or small town routine. This congregation was the town itself. Every single face I had encountered during my brief stay in Harlow was present in that room. I spotted Roy Ellison sitting in the front row, his posture rigid, his thick neck scrubbed clean. Pete Greer was a few pews back, his arm wrapped tightly around a smiling woman who must have been his wife, his broad mechanical smile firmly pinned to his face. Margaret Cho sat near the center aisle, her hands folded neatly over a leather-bound book, and all the way in the back, tucked into a dim corner pew, was Joe. She caught my eye almost immediately. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just gave me a long, heavy look that I couldn't entirely decipher. It was a devastating mixture of intense warning and absolute resignation. The service itself was terrifyingly ordinary. We sang traditional hymns that I half remembered from my childhood, the voices of 1,200 people rising in a unified, deafening swell that made the wooden floorboards vibrate beneath my boots. There was a scripture reading from a text I couldn't quite identify, followed by a sermon that never once mentioned, I want to make something absolutely clear before I tell you what happened next. I did not break the rule on purpose. I am not a hero in a horror movie who deliberately seeks out the monster to prove a point. By my second week in Harlow, I had become terrified of the dark. I had bought heavy blackout curtains for every window. I was a model citizen, but the real world doesn't care about town curfews. Exactly 2 weeks after my conversation with Minister Cole, I had to drive into the city for a final in-person interview for a remote project management position, a job I had been desperately chasing since before my life fell apart. The interview was scheduled for late afternoon, but the hiring panel ran nearly 2 hours behind schedule. Afterward, the managing director insisted on taking me out to an upscale dinner down the street to finalize the contract details. It was an incredible opportunity, the kind of professional lifeline I couldn't afford to cut short. By the time I finally excused myself, got to my car, and hit the highway, it was already past 11 p.m. Then, the universe seemed to actively conspire against me. A massive construction bottleneck on the interstate forced me off the main highway and onto a winding network of unfamiliar, unlit state back roads. I missed a crucial turn in the pitch black, adding 20 agonizing minutes to my GPS arrival time. I watched the digital clock on my dashboard change with a sense of pure, unadulterated panic. 11:45, 11:50, 11:50. I pulled onto Harlow's Main Street at exactly 12:09 a.m., 9 minutes late. The town was completely dark, engulfed in that terrifying, soundless vacuum I had witnessed from my porch. The green lamp posts were completely extinguished now, the streets illuminated only by the twin halogen beams of my sedan cutting through the thick, creeping ground fog. Every single storefront was a black void. Every house I passed was entirely dead to the world. The only light in the entire valley belonged to my car, moving like a beacon of defiance through a graveyard. I tried to leave Harlow on a Tuesday morning. The sun was shining brightly, the birds were chirping in the pristine oak trees, and the town looked exactly like the peaceful sanctuary it pretended to be. I packed 2 large duffel bags with my clothes, my laptop, my grandmother's documents, and every valuable possession I could shove into the trunk of my car. I didn't care about the security deposit. I didn't care about the lease. I just wanted my life back. I started the engine, backed out of the driveway without looking at Pete Greer's house, and drove down Main Street toward the highway. I reached the exact geographical boundary of the town limits, the precise intersection where the narrow Harlow Road meets the wide, open lanes of the state highway. The blue sign reading "Thank you for visiting Harlow" was right there, 10 feet away. I stopped the car. The highway was entirely clear. My sedan was running perfectly, the gas tank was full, and for the first time in 3 long weeks, my smartphone showed a full, beautiful 5 bars of cellular signal. Freedom was a simple press of the accelerator away. I sat at that intersection for 45 minutes. I want to tell you an honorable lie. I want to tell you that some invisible, supernatural force field stopped my car. I want to tell you that the tenant had placed a physical curse on my bloodline, or that my hands locked onto the steering wheel, making it physically impossible for me to turn the tires onto the highway. But that would be a coward's narrative. The truth is far simpler and far, far worse. I thought about what Minister Cole had said during our handshake. I thought about his words regarding the people who choose to fight the arrangement, the people who try to leave, the people who try to expose the town to the outside world. They tend to find that their situation becomes considerably worse than the situation of the people who simply close their curtains at midnight and go to sleep. And then I thought about the 3 residents Joe had described to me in the corner booth of the diner. The ones who had broken the rule, been caught and returned. They were alive. They were perfectly functional. I have been living in Harlow for 8 months now. My remote job is incredibly stable, providing a consistent income that allows me to live comfortably without ever having to leave my house past dusk. I never have to explain to a supervisor or a client why I can't attend a late night dinner, a corporate mixer, or a networking event that runs past midnight. My neighbors have become wonderfully friendly. Pete Greer waves to me every time I mow the lawn. Margaret Cho brings over fresh pies from her garden. Joe at the diner always remembers exactly how I take my coffee. And last month, Roy Ellison came over and replaced the soft floorboards on my back porch without me even having to ask. It is a genuinely good life. It is a safe life in the highly specific way that a life can be defined as good when you accept its rigid limits and stop asking what lies beyond them. But there is one final thing I need to tell you before my time runs out tonight. Exactly 2 weeks ago, I was sitting in the tap room for happy hour, enjoying a quiet drink by the window. A woman walked through the front doors. She was in her late 30s, possessed a frantic, hyper alert energy, and had a car with out of state license plates parked right outside the glass. She had that unmistakable, anxious look of a city person who was doing the mental math on a new, unfamiliar environment. She took a seat at the bar. She began chatting with the bartender, asking him questions about the town's safety, the community, and what the neighborhood was like for newcomers. The bartender answered her with the exact same fluid, practiced, relentlessly normal warmth that they had used on me. And then she asked the question. She laughed nervously and said, "So, what time does everything close down around here? Is there any nightlife?" I watched the bartender's face from my table. I saw that tiny, imperceptible pause. I saw that careful, mechanical selection of words. He smiled and said, "Oh, Harlow gets pretty quiet after midnight. The people here prefer to keep traditional hours.